native. My parents still live in Teaneck. I was raised, it was nostalgic in coming into this theater. And the invitation is also a very important one for the Coalition of 100 Black Women. Many of these women were a part of my childhood, raising me through not just my teenage years, my professional development years. So to be given this stage to have this conversation with a creative, a Black creative, but being invited by Black women who are investing in making sure this platform for Black women exists. I think I cannot ignore that moment. So I want to thank the Coalition of 100 Black Women and their leadership for making sure this conversation was had. This story continues to be told. And they do it in a strategic point by uplifting other young Black women. So thank you for the organization to be doing this. That really sets the platform for this dialogue, not a moderation, just a really beautiful dialogue between creatives. And I want to first talk about the intentionality of the storytelling through this film. One of the things that we talked about outside, or noted outside, that there was cartoon and animation points throughout the story. And that really laid the ground, or gave space to what was missing in the history, teaching, and the documentation of her story. So can you tell the audience in your creative perspective why that was placed and what the need and what that filled in that gap?
So I actually have a background in archival research, so I did a lot of the archival research for this film. But there are certain places and instances where archive just doesn't quite, bridge the whole gap of telling a story. For instance, Hazel staging a walkout on the Columbia set. There's no footage of a walkout on the Columbia set. And so to really bring that story to life without doing a reenactment, we decided to try something different and use animation. And I think it really helped illuminate the film and really kind of bring you into the story to have, and I wanted to make sure that it had kind of like an Art Deco kind of early animation feel, and I think that really served the story well. Another part that we used animation that I think was really useful is to, to kind of tell our story in Trinidad. I think that was really just, really cute. A little, of course, there was no footage of her in the 1920s in Trinidad, but that little saucy picture kind of bookends it. It really brings you into the life of a young Hazel.
What I think we're touching on is the conversation of why there was no footage and the intentionality that when I first witnessed this piece of artwork, I was a little bit upset at myself, right? So I'm running a Black arts institution. Newark Symphony Hall is the largest Black run and operated arts institution in the state of New Jersey. And it's important to know that. But what we try to do is ensure that the history and the culture is preserved, not just Black history, but like diverse history. So we create that platform in that space. And what I think you are alluding to and what was shown intentionally is the masking, the destroying, the undocumentation of this icon, right? And I think you did a beautiful component of that. But can you lead into like really her story and why it was so intentional?
Oh, so yeah, so like I mentioned, we wanted to bridge those gaps where we didn't have like actual footage to tell that story. But a bigger part of her story and why we don't know her today is that, for instance, that she had the first Black person to host her own TV show. You would think you'd be seeing clips of that in every TV documentary about the history of television, or that's entertainment. But the reason we don't see Hazel Scott especially, is because that archive of her work is almost solely in France, you could say. There's the 5 Hollywood films in which she was featured, but a lot of those clips were cut out of the films, for instance, when they played in the South. And that was a standard practice at the time, due to the racial politics of America. But Hazel Scott's show itself, although it was very successful for its time, once it was canceled, it later was destroyed by the network. And as the story goes, it was dumped into the Hudson River. And so there are no copies of the show that exist today. There's rumors that there perhaps might be a kinescope in Canada somewhere, but aside from that rumor, there's no copies of the show that we can refer to, that no historian even can look at and study. All we know about the show is what was written about it. And that just really speaks to whether it was standard network practice or a deliberate attack on or deliberate it's deliberate regardless. But that erasure, it was a literal erasure of her legacy, and that we're suffering from that today, and now we don't know her story.
And I think that as a storyteller, where you are telling this story, probably not by your plan, but God's plan. This story is being told in this moment of our culture, where diversity, individualism, the support for individual and creativity is being stripped away, hidden, taken off of major networks. And as a creator, as a Black female creator, if you can have one thing for everyone to take away in that point by watching this film and sharing this film and talking about this film, right? That's our homework, right? Is to share and to talk about this moment in history. What do you want people to take away from and what you're telling in the story, how important it is to preserve our history?
Well, I mean, what we can learn from Hazel's story especially is it's really frightening how total an erasure can be in just a span of years. And we're seeing that play out now, where the institutions that we rely on to pay our history forward are under attack and being closed down, or archives are being rewritten to tell a different story. Hazel was someone that was a global star, a national figure. I mean, she was in Life magazine. There was no higher accolade in the United States at that time. And for us not to know her today, it's really frightening that, someone that big, it's like thinking of, say, like a Beyonce today. 10 years they wouldn't know who she is because the archive has been erased. So that, the fact that that can happen is incredible.
I think it's really scary, and a note that I grew up on Jet magazine on the table, right? In the house, on your coffee table, you had that week, who was on the cover, what was that story? And you showed and documented multiple covers she was on. But it's really scary that what is our platform right now that has our artists, our story on there for us to preserve, that can't do it. And that's a scary time, moment in time we're dealing with right now.
It really is, because right now we're in the digital age. Of course, we rely so much on technology to exchange information. But at a time where the physical archives are being under attack, what's to say the danger of a digital age is that it can be unplugged. And then where are all these pictures going to go if the cloud is gone?
Love those cloud memories.
Those cloud memories are great, but if they decide to shut down, iCloud, where's all your pictures? You won't have them. You have to rely on your physical photo album. But the reason we take so many pictures of kids today, our neighbors, our weddings, our things, because we have unlimited means to do so. But if that were all to disappear, which it can, you really have to preserve and physically preserve and to orally tell your stories. Those oral stories have lasted for generations, and they will continue to do so because we pass them on. But but it is ephemeral, and it's in danger of disappearing entirely.
A good transition to the conversation of what I saw throughout the film was this generational core value of standing, or foresight to stand up for yourself, right? And she did it in so many different ways. So let's first attack it from her mother. I think, there's sisterhood conversations throughout the whole story of her lifetime, but let's talk about the foundation of her mother that gave her the importance of the core value to invest in female art. She had her own band. Think about that right now, So what can we pull from that from her story about where her mother created this platform to stand up and have that space to make sure she was represented exactly the way she needed to be.
Well, Hazel grew up in she grew up surrounded by women, and her entire life and worldview was shaped by the idea of sisterhood, like by learning at the foot of her mother and her grandmother, to uplift and support women and to push them forward, create opportunities for each other. And like you said, it did start with her mother, creating a band where not only she could showcase her new talent of playing the saxophone, but other, Black women artists could go out there and perform. And then that also became a platform where her own daughter could kind of hone her talent further and then go out in the world and become her own great musician and encounter Billie Holiday, who created opportunities for her. So all of those ways I kind of wanted to, have that through line of sisterhood throughout the film.
I think that foundation was that moment of the strike, right? I think we can name and brand that strike, no aprons, right? And I think it was, right? But I think it was a beautiful moment as artists, as creatives that we are in this space, mine administrative and your, as an actual creator of art, where we lie in our risk level of ensuring that we, one, create deals for ourselves, right, economically, to do this art, to preserve this art, to have investments in art, right, to make sure we're structuring the deal correctly. Because that's what she did, right? She made sure that I was going to be Black women, she was going to be represented the way the reality of Black women were, the culture in that family. So do you ever find yourself as a creative doing the work in this space, being tested or thought about that strategy foresight and ensuring that, one, you have rights to your work and you're represented as a Black female creator?
I think that really more manifests itself in just advocating for yourself in the workspace or in your in your career. I don't know who today has that kind of that fortitude, that courage to kind of put their own career on the line for others. And if they do, I'd like to see it. I would like to hear about it. But that's what's so remarkable, that a 22-year-old woman who was at the height of her power, put her life on, literally put her life on the line for other Black women. And it cost her, but it didn't stop her.
Oh, that's beautiful. It cost her, but it didn't stop her. That's
Ours.
Yeah. So I think we have an opportunity to have some Q&A and questions, and I think it's a great opportunity to understand the perspective of the artists while they're going through this masterpiece and this history. What was so important to pull out, right? Well, because you probably saw so many different angles of stories. We could talk about so many different topics, social impact stories that we saw here. But just limited time. So I want to open, the floor to any questions that you want to ask of the director. Because she did a fabulous job.
Yeah.
Over here.
I really enjoyed the film. It was beautifully done. And I was curious to know, you had so many beautiful moments of seeing the film version of her. Like, how did you find so much history of her in archival sense? Like, where did you find her on the beach, and then, those moments that were so, personal, I guess you would say. Did you find that in your research? Like, how's one? Yeah.
So a lot of the footage that you see in the film of Hazel, a lot of the later stuff that you see where she's older, and then the Hollywood films, and then of course the Ed Sullivan Show, that's all from the United States archives. But a large bulk of that we use peppered throughout the film is from the French. The French are notoriously really invested in archiving their own television, their own films and movies. And because she was there for so long and had such a really great career there, we were able to mine those archives. We had a really great photo. I don't even know if it's still in film, but we had a really great clip of Hazel with a pot of rice, and then she'd been cooking for Dizzy Gillespie and a bunch of artists. So a lot of that footage of her shopping in the streets of Paris. All of that was from this one French archive, INA. But yeah, we did like a kind of a worldwide search. We had a little bit of footage from Italy that didn't make it into the film, but yeah, we did an extensive, we cast a wide net, and that's where you see it on the stage.
I think it was beautiful that you touched on the story of Black artists leaving the States to be free artists overseas. And we never really hear so many writers that did that, but never her story. That she had that freedom of space, and when she was challenged, that's when she freaked out. Yeah, she was like, that man came over here, she's like, no, stay over there, right? I think it's beautiful to capture that conversation in the story.
Yeah, usually when you hear about people, expatriates living in France, it kind of stops at James Baldwin and Josephine Baker. Yeah, but there's quite a lot of artists that have found their, freedom in France.
Another question out there? Do you have
So the next one over here.
Again, my thanks for, I've heard of Hazel Scott growing up with the older elders in my family, but not to the extent that you offered. But I wondered if you found that the socialization that she was reared in by both her grandmother and mother were indicative also of some, shall I say, cultural ethos that was part of the Trinidadian culture. And I didn't know if you wanted to comment on some of that background as well, because she was so fierce in her understanding that she would not be kept down, she would not be abused in any way by the isms that were absolutely present throughout her life. New York, Hollywood, and so on and so forth.
I don't know so much it was a cultural thing, because, being West Indian descendant myself, we're pretty straight-laced people in certain respects. But I feel like her and her mother were just really kind of free-spirited in a way that was not unusual, but very much a product of the time. And that's why they fit into the Harlem Renaissance so easily. It's the jazz age. I think there was a whole wave of this kind of freedom of thinking and freedom of living that kind of took hold of them. I'm like, I don't know if it really had to do with being Trinidadian, for instance.
Well, there is this conversation. The only reason why I'm tapping into it is I'm listening to Audible, Langston Hughes' autobiography right now. And he actually touches on that same topic of that West Indian culture, that grit, and the cultural differences between a Black West Indian and a Black American, how in West Indian culture they saw Black people as doctors and in their economic community, and then coming into Harlem, where a lot of that jazz, Harlem Renaissance were, that cultural change was some part of that story. So we can probably dive into it separately, but it's perspective. I would think so.
I'm just more especially these two women, especially just that kind of and like blazing their trail. I feel like that's so much more of the time. But it could be the West Indian or the cultural aspect of it. But then there's so much of that was happening in New York. Yeah, the negritude movement at the same time as well. So.
Thank you for this film. It was awesome. The most impactful moment for me was definitely the strike, because I felt that her perspective was not unreasonable. When we look back at photos of our ancestors, we see that women were always dressed impeccably as much as possible. So when people tell stories from their culture, their own culture, they know how things are supposed to be portrayed. So that was very, that just impacted me. So I wanted to know about your research. How did you find out about the strike and just the process of uncovering that story?
Well, she had an unpublished manuscript for an autobiography, and so we had that archived to derive from. And then, they've spoken, so there's a book by Karen Chilton, a biography of Hazel Scott, and she did a really exhaustive, she also looked at the manuscript, but also did extensive research, and from those two sources, we were able to piece that story together.
We have a question back here.
This was wonderful. Congratulations, you did a great job. I'm always curious to find out, what is your background and how did you come to this project?
Oh, where do you want me to start? I was actually born and raised in Bloomfield, New Jersey. It's about 20 minutes away. Went to Johns Hopkins University to become a doctor. Did not graduate as a pre-med student. But I always had an interest in media. I always had an interest in television, especially. So I went to broadcasting school in Baltimore. And then got a job at a PBS show, To the Contrary, which is an all-women's news and political discussion show. And then I got involved in documentary film, and so that's what brought me to working on films with, for instance, Stanley Nelson, who Tiff has had a long relationship with. My first film with Stanley was The Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution. And we've been working on a number of films, including We Want the Funk, which you all screened for this summer. And so I kind of had a circuitous route. Now, I love to tell young people where you start is not necessarily where you end up. Just you focus on, trusting your own talent, focused on things that really interest you. Once you find something that you enjoy, you'll never work a day in your life. And so that's how I got to become involved in documentary films. And then I was actually approached to direct this film as a former employee of American Masters. And when they had this film that needed a director, they said, it'd be really incredible if you could, take this on. And of course, I was excited to be the first person to tell the story of Hazel Scott on the screen. So that's how I got here.
Awesome. So I think we can close with this. I think this was beautiful, and I want to thank the intentionality of TIFF on their 20th anniversary to start and lead this festival with the conversation of Black women. The core and how we move our story and preserve it. So if you can leave this audience with one thing, that was very critical and important that you wanted to tell the masses by doing this project, what would that be?
Well, again, thank you to the we get the letters all in. National Coalition of 100 Black women who recognize the theme of sisterhood in this film, and really have championed it to be this opening night film for this festival is a real honor for me. That message of sisterhood, especially now, I think is so important. As I was saying out in the lobby, I think now more than ever we need to link arms and march forward and face whatever it is that's coming down the line. And taking the message of a Hazel Scott, when you feel you're right, fight for what you believe in.